From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. The other question that these continual votes raise is what Republican could get to a majority vote if the rules are not changed. We've had Byron Donalds now that has been nominated today. We had Jim Jordan yesterday. We have not had a vote yet with Steve Scalise, the number 2 Republican. He seems to be continuing to back McCarthy and being a loyal number 2 to the guy who's been in charge of the Republican caucus since 2019. Kim, I mean, is there anybody in your mind who would be able to bridge this divide and get the support of the 20 or so rebels here while also maintaining the support of the majority of the Republican conference?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the people who would be more likely to be in that position. One of them would be Jim Jordan. He's obviously a member of the leadership, but he is much more conservative than other members of the leadership. He certainly has a lot of enthusiastic support among the rebels. And to his credit, he has earned a lot of support among the rest of the caucus by being such a loyal member of the leadership and by sticking by McCarthy throughout all of this. Remember, he was one of the guys that nominated McCarthy yesterday, gave a rousing speech, got a standing ovation, only to then have the rebels nominate him to be Speaker of the House. But he hasn't changed his position. And I think that has earned him some trust. Here's the problem, is that people are so hardened in their positions at this moment and also so angry at what some of these 20 are doing that I can see a very high possibility that were he nominated, that let's say McCarthy stepped out and Jordan put his hand up, there would be some that would refuse to vote for him simply because those 20 support him. On the other hand, the other guy who I think is well positioned would be a natural choice would be Steve Scalise, who's currently McCarthy's deputy. But he has the same problem in reverse, meaning that while a lot of the folks who voted for McCarthy would likely support Scalise, many in the rebel faction might not, simply because those other guys are supporting Scalise. This is the dynamic we have working there at the moment. That's why you hear people talking about outside names. But I have to be honest with you that I find that much harder to imagine. There are some questions, first of all, of whether or not you can even have somebody who isn't in Congress as the speaker. There's a lot of people saying that's a straight up question, but there's a little bit of room there for debate. Also, it would largely require working in tandem with Democrats. And that is not something that I see a substantial number of Republicans willing to do, or maybe not even a substantial number of Democrats. And there could be some real downsides, obviously, to doing it as well.
Well, let me go first to the question of outside names. We have a listener, Alan, who says, in the event that the Republicans are unable to break the current stalemate, I have a crazy suggestion. How about going outside the Congress and appointing Paul Ryan as the next speaker? He has the experience, respect, and stature. I would agree with Alan that he has the experience and stature to do that. I think that Paul Ryan would probably say, not in a million years. I think he would be Sherman-esque in his lack of appetite for doing that job again. But there is a guy who is outside of Congress just recently, Fred Upton, former member of the House, Republican from Michigan. He is not saying no. Here's the quote from him. He said, "It's an intriguing suggestion that I have not rejected," unquote. And Monet, I mean, what do you make of this idea of finding some Republican who's not a member of the House who's respected on both sides?
Yeah, I think my first reaction would be it would be sort of an embarrassing concession of defeat by the Republican Party to have to resort to that. Again, I mean, we've had speakers throughout the history of this country, all of whom have been sitting members of the House of Representatives. The fact that within a group of 222 representatives in the Republican Party in the House, they're not able to find any consensus pick would just be confirmation of the disarray that exists there. And certainly anyone who they would put in place outside the House, it would be very clear is just there essentially as a placeholder and would be very weak in their ability to actually lead a unified Republican agenda. That said, it certainly would be a better alternative than essentially having the speakership revert to the Democrats or to having the office held empty for an indefinite period of time. I don't think that Upton himself is really a viable candidate. I believe he was known as one of the more moderate members of the House and probably would face the same doubts from the 20 rebels as Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise. But theoretically, if there is some person whose name they could float at some point, that could become a viable option.
Kim, what about the question of whether this is really constitutional? So the Constitution says the House of Representatives shall choose their speaker. And so there is nothing explicitly in the text that says that person has to be a member of the House. But amid this debate, these arguments are floating around. And I guess it's a little murkier than I personally thought it was before we got into this deadlock.
Here's the thing. One of the discussions that's going on here is that you just quoted the text of the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation, which preceded them, were a little bit more explicit about this. It said that Congress had the power to, quote, appoint one of their number to preside. And that has left open the question about what did that actually mean in terms of the Constitution. Now, some people would argue that the fact that the founders made the language looser was because they did, in fact, want there to be more openness in how all of this happens. But then again, there's some other problems that have potentially stood in the way here. I mean, one of the issues is if you can have a non-member, could you not have then a senator or a cabinet officer from the executive branch? And doesn't that create certain kind of constitutional problems, as it were? The idea that you're serving in particular in one office, and wouldn't there be a conflict if you went to serve in another? And so this is left open, the question of just what is constitutional or not. And I think it also is an additional reason why it seems, to me at least, still a pretty far-fetched, the notion that Republicans would or should reach outside of their own membership to try to find a new speaker.
The separation of powers issue is one that I find pretty convincing. So there's another clause of the Constitution that says, no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either house during his continuance in office. And as a separation of powers matter, basically that means that you can't appoint a member of the House as Treasury Secretary or Secretary of State, something like that. And theoretically, on this theory that you could appoint a Speaker of the House who is not a member of the House, then theoretically that person could be a member of the executive branch as well. Because if the Speaker is not a member of the House, that would not abridge this separation of powers question that is explicitly in the Constitution. Going outside the House would be an extraordinary move, given the political reality that here we have a whole chamber full of ambitious politicians who would love to get a promotion. There are contested leadership elections, not even for Speaker of the House, but for these lower offices all the time. And so the idea that a group of politicians would pick someone not among them to lead them, I just find that would be pretty unlikely. The other question then is whether Kevin McCarthy or Republicans will decide that they need Democratic help to try to elect a speaker, which would also be extraordinary. And the math makes that a little bit problematic as well, because recall, if you listen to yesterday's podcast, the number of votes for speaker is based on the number of people who are voting for named candidates. So if there's a faction of Democrats who decide they are going to vote present, that lowers the number that Kevin McCarthy would need to be elected. But if I'm doing the math right, you would need, more than a couple of dozen of them, which would be a pretty big ask of the Republican majority party to the minority party. And no doubt there would be a price for that.
Absolutely. I think your last point is the salient one. The idea that Democrats would go along and help to nominate or help to elect a more moderate speaker is certainly possible, either by voting present or by some of them choosing to throw their support behind a consensus pick. But I definitely don't think there's any reason to think they would do that unless major concessions were made. And you can't even comprehend what sorts of policy concessions any consensus candidate would have to make to Democrats in the House in order to get their support. And so the cost of that move would be to essentially break the House majority in the Congress. And I think that it's very likely that all Republican members are basically ruling out that possibility and will be continuing to debate internally before anyone makes a sort of strong and viable play for some kind of consensus pick with the Democrats.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.